Chapter 101, Wisdom Introduction. The special character of wisdom among the attainments of the mind shows itself in the things which everyone will agree can be said about wisdom, things which cannot be said about art and science, or knowledge and learning generally. We believe that, with the centuries, knowledge can be steadily increased and learning advanced, but we do not suppose that the same progress can be achieved in wisdom. The individual may grow in wisdom. The race does not seem to. In the tradition of the great books, the moderns usually assert their superiority over the ancients in all the arts and sciences. They seldom claim superiority in wisdom. The phrase modern science needs no elucidation, but if anyone were to speak of modern wisdom, he would have to explain his meaning. As modern seems to have an immediately acceptable significance when it qualifies science, so ancient seems to go with wisdom, and to suggest that, with the centuries, far from increasing, wisdom may be lost. Wisdom is more frequently and extensively the subject of discussion in the ancient and medieval than in the modern books. The ancients seem to have not only a greater yearning for wisdom, but also a greater interest in understanding what wisdom is and how it can be gained. The traditional discussion of wisdom, furthermore, has its foundations in the literature of the Old and the New Testament, as well as in the books of pagan antiquity. This is not true of other forms of knowledge. The teachings of revealed religion open a path to the heart of wisdom. They do not propose methods of scientific research. Again and again the scriptures proclaim that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, a wisdom which develops with piety and worship, as science develops with experiment and proof. Still another distinctive mark of wisdom is that it cannot be misused. We recognize that bad men as well as good may possess other kinds of knowledge. We have seen artistic skill and scientific truth put to evil use. But we do not ordinarily think a man wise unless he acts wisely. To act wisely is to act well, even as to have wisdom is to use it. The satirist's praise of folly condemns a useless wisdom. The theologian's condemnation of worldly wisdom dismisses it as the worst of folly, a counterfeit of wisdom. Other forms of learning may separate knowledge from action, wisdom tends to unite them. Other forms of inquiry may be content with knowing and understanding the facts. The pursuit of wisdom aspires to a knowledge of good and evil. Plato, for example, makes the vision of the good the goal of a dialectic which ascends to wisdom, yet which does not rest there, but returns enlightened to the realm of action. This conception of wisdom is hinted at whenever we refrain from calling a man wise simply because he is learned, a scholar, scientist, or philosopher. Again, it is Plato who respects wisdom so highly that he will not call the philosopher wise, but only a lover of wisdom. No god is a philosopher or seeker after wisdom, for he is wise already, Socrates says in the Symposium, nor does any man who is wise seek after wisdom. Neither do the ignorant seek after wisdom. The lovers of wisdom are neither the wise nor the ignorant and foolish. As Socrates points out, they are in a mean between the wise and the ignorant. Aristotle would seem to disagree, not from a lower regard for wisdom, but because he identifies wisdom with philosophical knowledge, and especially with that highest branch of speculative science which is called theology, first philosophy, or metaphysics. His use 1102. Chapter 101, Wisdom 1103. Of the phrase philosophical wisdom to distinguish speculative from practical or political wisdom suggests that the philosopher may attain the wisdom he pursues. Yet Aristotle, like Plato, speaks of philosophers or lovers of wisdom, and Plato, like Aristotle, treats wisdom as one of the basic human virtues. We shall return to the distinction which both Aristotle and Aquinas make between practical and speculative wisdom. They often call the latter simply wisdom, in contrast to prudence, which is their name for practical wisdom. Other writers, who treat wisdom as one, sometimes emphasize its speculative, and sometimes its practical, aspect. But for all of them, this double aspect remains part of wisdom's special character. Lucretius, for example, finds nothing more gladdening than to dwell in the calm high places, firmly embattled on the heights by the teaching of the wise, whence you can look down on others, and see them wandering hither and thither, going astray as they seek the way of life, free from pain. The distress of fear, and futile struggle, is known only to the wise. Calm and repose are here suggested as attributes of the wise man. That also seems to be the implication of Dr. Johnson's approbation of one who had attained to the state of the philosophical wise man, that is, to have no want of anything. When Boswell observes that then the savage is a wise man, Johnson retorts, "Sir, I do not mean simply being without, but not having a want." For Plotinus, wisdom seems to be purely speculative, and its repose a condition of the reasoning mind at rest. Wisdom, he writes, is a condition in a being that possesses repose. Think what happens when one has accomplished the reasoning process. As soon as we have discovered the right course, we cease to reason. We rest because we have come to wisdom. Still, wisdom has a moral or, for Plotinus, an aesthetic aspect. One soul, he says, is wise and lovely, another foolish and ugly. Soul beauty is constituted by wisdom. The practical or moral aspect of wisdom predominates in Milton, Rabelais, and Tolstoy. In Paradise Lost, Adam communicates his reflections on human knowledge to Raphael. But opti the mind or fancy is to rove unchecked, and of her roving is no end, till warned, or by experience taught, she learned that not to know at large of things remote from use, obscure and subtle, but to know that which before us lies in daily life, is the prime wisdom, what is more, is fume, or emptiness, or fond impertinence, and renders us in things that most concern unpracticed, unprepared, and still to seek. Gargantua, writing a letter to his son Pantagruel while the latter is a student in Paris, admonishes him in the words of Solomon that wisdom entereth not into a malicious mind, and that knowledge without conscience is but the ruin of the soul. In War and Peace, Pierre, after reiterating that all we can know is that we know nothing, and that's the height of human wisdom, learns from the Mason that the highest wisdom is not founded on reason alone, nor on those worldly sciences of physics, chemistry, and the like, into which intellectual knowledge is divided. The highest wisdom, the Mason continues, is but one science, the science of the whole, the science explaining the whole creation and man's place in it. To receive that science it is necessary to purify and renew one's inner self, and to attain this end, we have the light called conscience that God has implanted in our souls. Though Plato defines wisdom as the virtue of reason, that part of the soul which is for him the faculty of knowledge, he gives it the function of directing conduct as well as contemplating truth. Him we call wise. Socrates declares in the Republic, who has in him that little part which rules and which has a knowledge of what is for the interest of each of the three parts and of the whole, in the state as in the soul. How can there be the least shadow of wisdom? The Athenian stranger asks in the Laws, where there is no harmony or wisdom when fair reasonings have their habitation in the soul, and yet do no good, but rather the reverse of good because reason fails to rule or be obeyed. When the soul is opposed to knowledge, or opinion, or reason, which are her natural lords, the Athenian stranger goes on, that I call folly, just as it is in the state. When the multitude refuses to obey their rulers or the laws, the four virtues which Plato enumerates. 1104. The great ideas in both the Republic and the Laws are wisdom, temperance, courage, justice. Justice is given a certain preeminence in the Republic as somehow embracing the other three, but in the Laws, the ruling virtue is wisdom, calling the virtues divine goods to distinguish them from such things as health, beauty, strength, and wealth. The Athenian stranger makes wisdom chief and leader of the divine class of goods. Next, he says, follows temperance, and from the union of these two with courage springs justice, and fourth in the scale of virtue is courage as the principle of these other virtues. Wisdom like them engages in the life of action. It does not move solely in the realm of thought. When he refers to wisdom as one of the four virtues, Aristotle uses the word wisdom as if it named a single virtue. In the passage in the Politics in which he says that the courage, justice, and wisdom of a state have the same form and nature as the qualities which give the individual who possesses them the name of just, wise or temperate, he does not divide wisdom into the speculative and the practical, but he seldom overlooks that separation. The passage just cited, for instance, begins with the statement that each one has just so much happiness as he has of virtue and wisdom, and of virtuous and wise action. Here the reference to virtue and wisdom places wisdom outside the virtues, when the latter are conceived exclusively as moral virtues. Wisdom for Aristotle is a virtue only in the order of intellectual excellence, not of moral excellence or character. As an intellectual virtues, wisdom is not even involved in the growth or exercise of the moral virtues. It is as possible, Aquinas says, following Aristotle, to have the cardinal moral virtues without wisdom, as it is to have them without art or science. But for both Aquinas and Aristotle this is neither true nor intelligible unless we bear in mind the distinction between philosophical and practical wisdom, or between wisdom and prudence. Though prudence is, no less than wisdom, an intellectual virtue, a quality of mind rather than of character, it belongs with the moral virtues. As the chapter on virtue indicates, the cardinal virtues according to Aquinas elude prudence, not wisdom. Similarly, as may be seen in the chapter on prudence, Aristotle's theory holds it impossible to be good without practical wisdom, just as it is impossible to be practically wise without moral virtue. Practical wisdom, Aristotle writes, is concerned with things human and things about which it is possible to deliberate. Philosophic wisdom, on the other hand, will contemplate none of the things that make a man happy. To explain the difference, Aristotle uses the example of the early Greek sages. We say Anaxagoras, Thales, and men like them have philosophic but not practical wisdom, when we see them ignorant of what is to their own advantage. They know things that are remarkable, admirable, difficult, and divine, but use less, viz., because it is not human goods they seek. If wisdom connotes the highest form of knowledge, then the name, according to Aristotle, is more properly applied to speculative than to practical wisdom. The highest form of knowledge, in his view, is concerned with the highest objects. Hence, he says, it would be strange to think that practical wisdom is the best knowledge, since man is not the best thing in the world. But if the argument be that man is the best of the animals, this makes no difference, for there are other things much more divine in their nature than man. And wisdom is knowledge of the things that are highest by nature. When Hobbes distinguishes between prudence and sapience, he does not assign a special object to wisdom. As much experience is prudence, he writes, so is much science, sapience. It is the amount of science a man possesses, not his possession of a particular kind of knowledge, which makes him wise. Descartes seems to take a similar view when he says that the sciences taken all together are identical with human wisdom, but for Aristotle and Aquinas, philosophical wisdom can be differentiated from the other speculative virtues, such as the understanding of first principles or the scientific knowledge of the conclusions which can be demonstrated from them. It involves them, but it is distinct from them insofar as it uses principles to demonstrate conclusions concerning the highest causes. Wisdom can be. Chapter 101, Wisdom 1105 called a science if it is understood that by reason of its object it stands at the apex of the sciences, crowning and perfecting them. In the opening pages of his Metaphysics, Aristotle identifies wisdom with the supreme philosophical science, the science which investigates first principles and causes. He calls it a divine science or theology, for, as he says, God is thought to be among the causes of all things and to be a first principle. It is not the most useful science, but the most desirable on its own account and for the sake of knowing. It alone exists for its own sake. All the sciences, indeed, are more necessary than this, but none is better. While adopting Aristotle's conception of wisdom, Aquinas finds it most eminently represented among the sciences, not by metaphysics or the theology of the philosophers, but by sacred doctrine or the theology based on revelation. Since it is the part of a wise man to order and to judge, he writes, and since lesser matters can be judged in the light of some higher cause, therefore, he who considers absolutely the highest cause of the whole universe, namely God, is most of all called wise. But sacred doctrine essentially treats of God viewed as the highest cause, for it treats of him not only so far as he can be known through creatures just as the philosophers know him, but also so far as he is known to himself alone and revealed to others. Hence, Aquinas concludes, sacred doctrine is especially called wisdom. The contrast between the wisdom of the philosopher and the wisdom of the theologian is more fully discussed in the chapters on metaphysics and theology, but we are concerned here with the further implications of the difference between natural and supernatural wisdom, or the wisdom of man and of God. The Greeks insistently raise the question whether man can have wisdom. In the Apology, Socrates tells his accusers that his cross-examination of the pretenders to wisdom was a duty imposed upon him by the oracle, which declared that there was no man wiser than himself. To understand the oracle's meaning, he tried to seek out wisdom in other men, but, he says at his trial, I found that the men most in repute were all but the most foolish. This gave him an insight into the kind of wisdom which he himself possessed. My hearers always imagine, Socrates declares, that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others, but the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise. And by his answer he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates, he is only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. Again in the Phaedrus, Socrates refuses to call any man wise, for that is a great name which belongs to God alone. For men, lovers of wisdom or philosophers, is the modest and befitting title. Aristotle also says of the science which most deserves the name of wisdom, because it is a science of divine things, that such a science either God alone can have, or God above all others. He does not think that the divine power can be jealous, but if there were any truth in what the poets say about the jealousy of the gods, it would probably occur in this case above all, and all who excelled in this knowledge would be unfortunate. To whatever extent the possession of wisdom might be justly regarded as beyond human power, it would be unfitting, in Aristotle's opinion, for man not to be content to seek the knowledge that is suited to him. This is even more typically a Christian than a pagan sentiment. Christians have a special knowledge, writes Montaigne, how natural and original an evil curiosity is in man. The thirst of knowledge, and the desire to become more wise, was the first ruin of humankind, and the way by which it precipitated itself in eternal damnation and paradise lost. As he is about to leave the Garden of Eden, Adam says to the angel Michael, greatly instructed I shall hence depart. greatly in peace of thought, and have my fill of knowledge, what this vessel can contain, beyond which was my folly to aspire. To which the angel replies, this having learned, thou hast attained the summit of wisdom. But sacred scripture does more than enjoin man to humble himself before the chasm. B. 1106 The great ideas tween human wisdom at its best and the infinite wisdom of God. It does more than say in the words of Jeremiah, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, for it also says that fools despise wisdom. In the epistle of James we find true wisdom set apart from false. If the knowledge of the wise man is not accompanied by the meekness of wisdom, if instead there is bitter envying and strife in your hearts, then this wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, and without hypocrisy. St. Paul asks, hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? When the world by wisdom knew not God, it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them which are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. My speech and my preaching, St. Paul continues to the Corinthians, was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Howbeit we speak wisdom among them that are perfect, yet not the wisdom of this world, nor of the princes of this world, that come to naught, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden mystery, which God ordained before the world unto our glory. Wonder is the beginning of the kind of natural wisdom which a philosopher like Aristotle regards as the ultimate goal of human inquiry. But the supernatural wisdom of which Scripture speaks begins with the fear of God and comes to man not through his efforts at learning, but only as a divine gift. If any of you lack wisdom, St. James declares, let him ask God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. It is wrong for a man to take pride in his own learning, but, according to Pascal, the proper place for pride is in wisdom, for it cannot be granted to a man that he has made himself wise. God alone gives wisdom, and that is why qui gloriatur. In Domino Gloriter, the theologians dwell at length on the text of the psalmist that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, enumerating 7 steps to wisdom. Augustine writes, first of all, it is necessary that we should be led by the fear of God to seek the knowledge of his will, what he commands us to desire and what to avoid. Now this fear will of necessity excite in us the thought of our mortality and of the death that is before us, and crucify all the motions of pride as if our flesh were nailed to the tree. Then in succession come the steps of piety, knowledge, resolution, counsel, purification of heart, and, finally, the holy man will be so single and so pure in heart that he will not step aside from the truth, either for the sake of pleasing men or with a view to avoid any of the annoyances which beset this life. Such a man ascends to wisdom, which is the 7th and the last step, and which he enjoys in peace and tranquility. Only the wisdom which begins with faith, according to Aquinas, also begins with fear. A thing may be called the beginning of wisdom in 2 ways, he explains. In one way, because it is the beginning of wisdom itself as to its essence; in another way, as to its effect. Thus the beginning of an art as to its essence consists in the principles from which that art proceeds, while the beginning of an art as to its effect is that wherefrom it begins to operate. Aquinas then points out that wisdom is considered by theologians in one way, and in another way by philosophers, as the wisdom of the philosophers does not begin with articles of faith but with axioms of reason, so it does not begin with fear but with wonder. The wisdom of the philosophers and the wisdom of the religious both consist in knowledge of divine things, but wisdom, as we look at it, Aquinas writes, is considered not only as being cognizant of God, as it is with the philosophers, but also as directing human conduct, since this is directed not only by the human law, but by the divine law. Accordingly the beginning of wisdom as to its essence consists in the first principles of wisdom, i.e., the articles of faith. Chapter 101, Wisdom 1107. And in this sense faith is said to be the beginning of wisdom. But as regards the effect, the beginning of wisdom is the point where wisdom begins to work, and in this way fear is the beginning